Let me start recording.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UU Virtual Roundtable. My name is Sarah Reyes, and I will be today's moderator. So just a couple of things before we officially begin. I would like to remind everyone that we will be recording this week's session and uploading it to the official UUCLC YouTube channel. So if you're ever interested in sharing these discussions with others or just going back and rewatching, we encourage you to check it out as we upload them every Monday. Secondly, we will be having a brief presentation in which our speakers will introduce the topic of discussion. During this brief introduction, we ask that you hold off from asking any questions, as afterwards we will have a Q&A session afterwards where everyone will be able to give their thoughts and ask questions, things like that. So that's about it. And finally, thank you for attending, and I hope you have a really good roundtable.
Okay, so let's get started. First of all, we want to say that the roundtable today is intended to be a facilitated conversation, exploring what it might mean for our church to adopt the proposed eighth principle that many churches throughout the denomination are currently adopting as a means to promote its adoption by the Unitarian Universalist Association. So Rihanna and I are just going to do a quick job here of briefly setting the stage for the conversation, which will be led by Dr. Lara. So next slide, please. So let's take a look at the proposed eighth principle, which has grown out of more than a decade of study and discussion by groups within the UUA. It states, as our other 7 principles that guide our spiritual journey together, that we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. And then it goes on to state the principle, which in this case is journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at what our congregation has been doing to work toward racial justice in the past few years, starting with October of 2017, when the representatives from our Committee on Ministry and the Social Justice Committee attended the 3-day UUA Mosaic Makers Workshop to learn more about how to develop and lead a vital multicultural congregation. Next, you see, in August of 2017, in August of 2018, our church social justice committee organized a social justice collaborative with the UU fellowships of Otero County and Silver City. One of the 3 study action groups organized by the collaborative focused on anti-white supremacy and white privilege. This group took action to organize a 7-hour workshop in November of 2019. You see the 2019 IDI workshop, led by the UUA Pacific regional staff to learn from the aggregate intercultural development inventory assessment scores of the participants in each church, where our individual church was in the process of developing cultural competencies to create a diverse, beloved community. An outcome of this workshop was 2 study and action groups, which you see listed below there with the arrows. The first, the Multicultural Awareness Group, has conducted 15 meetings in the past year to study the research and literature on uprooting racism, and has taken action to begin to study what can be done in our larger community to dismantle racism. The second group, the Eighth Principle Project group, has been studying the history of the development of the Eighth Principle, reading research on racism, studying the 2020 report of the UUA Commission on Institutional Change, which is titled Widening the Circle of Concern, And they have planned, and this is one example of a number of awareness activities about what it would mean to truly implement the eighth principle in our church. Now, Rihanna will review with you what we found out from the Intercultural Development Inventory Assessment about where we are as a church in terms of our own multicultural competencies.
Good morning, everyone. I guess it's afternoon now. Good afternoon. So in November of 2019, a group of about 34 members participated in the Intercultural Development Inventory. And the Intercultural Development Inventory is really about moving from a monocultural mindset toward an intercultural or global mindset. And I'll give you a moment to take a look at some of the tenets of each of those mindsets here. And what we learned from that assessment is that as an aggregate group, those members tended toward minimization, which you can see is right here in the middle of that spectrum of moving from monocultural toward an intercultural mindset. At the minimization stage, people tend to highlight cultural commonalities and universal values and principles, which I'm not too surprised by, as we are Unitarian Universalists. And that may sound like a good thing, but one problem with that is that it tends to mask differences and minimize differences rather than appreciate and draw out differences. And that's one way that we can maintain a white supremacist culture, is by pretending that everyone's the same and everyone's equal, when that is not, in fact, the case. So our goal is to move from minimization to acceptance and then toward adaptation. At acceptance, we recognize and appreciate cultural differences rather than minimizing them. And then at adaptation, we make cultural changes in our congregation and the way we do things so that those differences are amplified and respected rather than minimized. As the eighth principle team moves forward, and I'm a member of that team along with Jane, we seek to really better understand how we can journey towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community, seeking to understand what is a multicultural community and how do we accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Jane and I believe that in order to move toward multicultural, beloved community, we have to understand how race and racism are connected to multiculturalism. And that is why we're so excited to have Dr. Dulcinea Lara here with us today. She is the director, and I want to get this right, so I wrote it down. Give me just a moment. Director of Borderlands and Ethnic Studies at NMSU. We're so excited to have Dr. Lara here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Thank you, Rihanna, and thank you, Jane. Can everyone hear me pretty well?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're coming through clear.
Okay. Hi, Paul. Thank you. So thank you all so much for inviting me and for facilitating this series, and certainly asking these important questions about race and racism and white supremacy, all of that. It's I know for some people these can be really touchy topics, but I feel like I talk about this all the time. I teach about it, so it's become very normalized. I just want to thank all of you that are on this call. I've been to your church, I think 3 times before, so some of the faces look familiar. It's nice to see you all again. Under these strange Zoom circumstances, I hope we can meet again in person one day. But I asked Jane and Rihanna if it would be okay to have more of a dialogue and a discussion, because I present a lot to different groups, different ages, different backgrounds, different geographical locations. And so it's helpful for me to understand a little bit more about the group that I'm speaking with. And Jane and Rihanna sent me some questions that might be useful for your congregation in terms of the question about race. I just want to, introduce myself a little bit and speak about why I consider myself a race scholar, why I do this work. That's very difficult. As an academic, it's work that's incredibly personal. It's incredibly taxing. It's both looking at sort of systemic issues and institutional issues and societal issues, at the same time experiencing how those issues act upon bodies of women, of people of color, of LGBTQ folks disproportionately. So it's very personal work as well. And it's, I think I've seen a real growth in this region. A real openness to have these difficult conversations. And so that makes me very happy because the more of us that get involved in sort of thinking about these things, the less personally it lands on particular people, the few people that are having these dialogues. So I was born and raised in this area. Like I said, I've met a lot of you, so you've probably heard my introduction before. Born and raised here in Berrino, New Mexico, which is sort of right in the middle between here and El Paso on I-10. I come from a farming family, many generations. My family on both sides has been in this region for 6 and 7 generations. So I consider myself a native of this region. I decided to leave this area and go to the Midwest. So I went to Michigan to study undergrad when I was 17 years old. And that was very formative for me to be in the Midwest as a young person who came from a very predominantly Hispanic background, Hispanic community. One second, my camera is doing something interesting. Okay, that's a little bit better. When I was in Michigan, I was talking to other college freshmen in the dorms, and we would ask each other, where are you from? And most of the people, it was a state school, Michigan State University. Most of the students would give their communities, and then the next question, which high school, which part of town, right? Everyone trying to kind of identify, where is this person from? You can tell a lot from about someone's class background if they tell you which high school they went to, for example. And I went to the Gadsden School District, which around here has kind of a tough connotation for being kind of the Hispanic or the Mexican school district. And so when I was in Michigan, 2,000 miles away from here, I don't know how many miles, but lots of miles away from here, I was able to say, I went to Gadsden High School in New Mexico, and that meant nothing to anyone. And so I started to realize there's a stigma that you carry around, right? And there's an unfreedom that you carry around if you're not able to kind of let those labels go. And I just experienced this for the first time, kind of freedom of this stigma of what Gadsden meant. And so I sort of think of race that way, as this kind of thing we carry around with us. And there's associations that people make with a racial background or with a class background. And so I started thinking, are these people much better than Gadsden people? As a young person, sort of trying to think, did I come from a place of less intelligence? Did I come from a place that was less meaningful? Is New Mexico less meaningful? And so as a young person, I just started to think about human relationships. I started to think about my relationship to myself, about my relationship to my hometown, to my family. I started to think then more deeply about race, about ethnicity, about gender, about belonging. And so I think like I've come full circle. Now I'm a tenured professor. I'm going up for a promotion. I've been here for 15 years at New Mexico State University. And I think a lot about what belonging really means. You know, what does it really mean to feel like you matter and to feel like you belong to a group? And you know, here we're talking in a religious congregation, and so you all know that membership is very sacred. It's very sacred to belong, and it's very special to belong in a place where everyone sees you as equally valuable. You know, I think it was 2 years ago that I came to your church, and some of the members were asking, how do we diversify our congregation? You know, I think we're very white. And, you know, I think that's an important question. How do we, and by we, I include all of us, how do we open doors and how do we close doors? Right. And so one of the things that's really important to know about this region is that 500 years of colonization, and we can talk more deeply about that history, has led to people of color closing the doors on ourselves, right? To self-abnegation. And so as we puzzle through this idea of how do I become more welcoming to others, I want us to even take a step back and think, how welcoming am I to myself? Right. And that's a question that I work through with my students, especially my students of color, who have been incentivized to negate themselves, who have been incentivized to make themselves smaller. And this can be applied, for example, to gender. If you think about women, women are incentivized to be smaller, be quieter, sort of take a back step. And so we can sort of think about positionality, right? What our status is in society. And, you know, I have my students, a lot of my students don't believe in any of this, which is fine. But they're very adamant in saying, Dr. Lara, you know, racism was in the 1950s. We've moved past that. You know, we had the civil rights movement, you know, and so they come to the table having been groomed to say that racism isn't a thing. And so one of the exercises I have my students do is to keep an accommodation journal for a day. And so, you know, really when we're talking about race and gender and LGBTQ and class and even religious affiliation hegemony, right? People talk about Christian hegemony, for example. I ask my students, take this little piece of paper with you throughout the day and mark every time that you have to make room for someone else to feel comfortable, or you have to step aside, or you have to be quiet in that moment that you didn't want to be quiet, or you have to pretend you don't know the answer to that math problem, for example, so that you don't overshadow someone, which is, you know, many studies show that girls act like they don't know the answers in science and math classes, so they don't overshadow the boys, right? These are things that we're conditioned to do very young. I have an 8-year-old, and I'm seeing this behavior, and I'm thinking, how do I impact her so that this doesn't happen to her? So I think at the end of the day, you know, these big words like racism and decolonization and the Black Lives Matter movement, all of those are outcomes of the fact that as humans over the course of history, world history, we have made it so that some people need to be smaller than others. And so, you know, that's very interesting to me. That my doctorate is in comparative ethnic studies. I teach classes on race and decolonization and the history of New Mexico and social justice. I'm very involved in the K-12 public school system right now and thinking about how can we collectively change our social studies curriculum so that we don't get to be into our 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s with very little understanding of what race is, how race manifests itself, and how come it's so undetectable, right? Even though we're talking about race today, for the most part, it's not tangible, right? Racism isn't quite tangible. It's not something that we can kind of see and put in a container. So that's why it's very difficult to address this big question of racism or oppression based on who we are. So I think that's kind of my introduction about why I do this work. And I don't know, Jane or Rihanna, if you'd like to maybe take some of the questions that you sent me or open up to a question here live, whatever your preference is.
Jane, go ahead. Oh, you got your
Mute, Jane.
Sorry. Dulcinea, you've got the list in front of you, and we really would like for you to go right ahead and pose any of those questions and open it up for you to go ahead and facilitate the questions and answers.
Okay, so you have a really good question, number 3, Jane, which is, what is race? And, you know, I teach that race is a social construct, right? For example, in the United States, we have 4 racial categories. In Brazil, they have dozens. In Mexico, they have 20 plus racial categories. So this idea that these racial categories are natural or essential to nature is just false, right? So race is a creation basically to support the booming explosion of modern day capitalism. And interestingly, I'm not a theologian, but I've been trained by some of the most incredible decolonial thinkers in the world. And, you know, Ramon Grossfogel, if you ever have a chance to look his work up, he's brilliant. I've studied with him for many years. He looks at actually Christianity as the nexus of the creation of race, for example. So, you know, back in the Constantine time in the 300s in the Roman Empire, Christianity became Trinitarian, right? So prior to Trinitarian Christianity, Christianity was Unitarian, and it was about everyone's divinity and inherent sacredness. And specifically, prior to Constantine, Christianity really valued the deep potential for philosophical thought in humans, all humans, right? And so there was flexibility in thinking, flexibility and inclusivity. These words that you hear now, these are old. You know, Unitarian Christianity was about pluralistic thinking. It was about possibility and really inhabiting our sacred divine selves, little s sacred. Constantine came around and wanted all the power, and so it became punishable to think anything other than believe in Trinitarian Christianity, and then he became God on earth, right, Constantine. So you Universalist Unitarian Christians have this really incredible, like, direct link to being in opposition to the creation of binaristic thinking, which is good versus evil, right? And I was raised in a Catholic background where it was very ingrained that there was one way to be, and you either were on the side of good or on the side of bad. And so anyway, I don't want to get into religious differences, but the foundation of distinction and hierarchy happens many years ago, but it wasn't based on race. It doesn't become based on race until much later on into the 13 and 1400s, when you have colonization on a mass scale happening, on a global scale happening with Africa, with South America, right? These land masses that now have these names, right? So I think, so race becomes a way to define people in a hierarchy and to allow for conquest, to allow for ongoing oppression for hundreds of years. And then conveniently, skin tone becomes part of race, right? Skin tone becomes part of race to distinguish Blackness and whiteness, brownness and whiteness, indigeneity and whiteness. So everything becomes divided in that way, but race is fairly new, and it's a creation to justify slavery and to justify genocide and to justify colonization. So race, you know, it's a construct. B, has very real lived consequences. So it's not just to say like, oh, it's an imaginary unicorn. No, it's a creation that lands on people's bodies disproportionately. The very unique thing about New Mexico is, I remember when I was picking my dissertation topic, and my professors were starting to see the research that was coming out from my dissertation about relationships. My dissertation was about tourism in the late 1800s in New Mexico and how race was used to both attract people as tourists, but also to kind of warn them that there's Native and Mexican people here. And my professors were like, what happened in New Mexico? It's almost like trapped in time. You know, in New Mexico, you can sort of draw these like direct lines from 1520, from 1598, from 1680. Like there's these very direct lines, these very clear analyses that you can make about how colonization has been very functional in this region. And so, you know, when it comes to Hispanicness, you know, in answering that question, what is race? You know, race for Hispanic people or Chicano people in this region, Mexican American people, you know, the history of Mexicanness is one that's born out of the conquest of indigenous people in this land by Europeans from Spain. You know, and so you can see how that's not an essential race called Hispanic. That's a people born of genocide. And the word Hispanic comes out in 1970, an invention of the Nixon administration that was loosely meant to sort of describe people who speak Spanish, right? And so Hispanic is a term very popular in this region. I found some people will identify as Chicano, some will identify as Latino, not as many, Mexican American. A lot of people who, even people who were born here and are not Mexican nationals, identify as Mexican. So there's all these different terms that can be kind of confusing. But what I want to impart is that the history and relationships between Native people and Hispanic people in this region is really tense. It's wrought with a lot of tension, I would say. And partially the reason for that is that, you know, when New Mexico became a territory, Hispanic, Spanish identifying people were granted citizenship where Native people were not, right? So this was like a direct policy related activity meant to divide Native people from Mexican people. There's a great historian, Lara Gomez. She was at UNM Law for a while. She's at UCLA now, I believe. She writes a book about Manifest Destiny, and she talks about how Manifest Destiny was a gift to white people, a detriment to Native people, and this kind of strange manifestation for Hispanic identifying people. So in the process of granting Hispanics citizenship and state rights in New Mexico, Hispanic people were also indirectly and directly incentivized to self-abnegate, to identify as close as possible to whiteness. And so Laura Gomez uses a term called off-white to label Hispanics in New Mexico, that there's this off-whiteness, that there's this constant self-abnegation in order to be as white as possible, but there's never the full attainment of whiteness, of the rights and the privileges and the benefits that are associated with whiteness. But Hispanics are incentivized to negate their true selves in order to try to reach that whiteness. So race is messy, it's complicated. When people talk about dismantling it, I'm like, oh my gosh, what does that even mean? And I think that we can look at ourselves first, and that's something that in ethnic studies and Chicano studies, there's a poem, a Mayan poem called the Inlakesh, and the Inlakesh is sort of like putting up a mirror and identifying yourself, but also, can you truly look at someone else and value them as much as you value yourself? And so what In Lakesh requires before you go out saying, I value you, you're equal to me, is, do you believe in your own sacred divinity? Do you believe in your own sacred divinity? And will you refuse to assimilate to something that you're not? And believe me, as someone who has been outspoken in this community for 15 years, there is so much at stake when you go against assimilation. When you decide to truly love yourself so much that you will not fit the mold because it doesn't work for you, you risk losing favor, losing your job, losing your status, losing your friends. There's so much at stake when people choose not to assimilate to something they are not. And all of us can recognize that somewhere, and all of us can identify with that. That's a universal feeling. When you do something that goes against your true being, it is detrimental to yourself. So the In Lakesh, the Mayan poem, says, you are my other me, right? And so that's beautiful and great. But when we talk about the Hispanic legacy of, for hundreds of years, this carrot being dangled, that if you deny your language, your heritage, your land base, your agricultural ways, your art ways, your hygiene ways, your medicine ways, if you deny all of that, what are you left with? This possibility to be someone else? It's not that great, but it's taken hold here. It's taken hold very strongly. When I was in Michigan, I did a senior thesis on identity, and I interviewed 12 sets of 3 generations of Mexican American families in Michigan, living in Michigan, who had 3 generations in Michigan minimum. And they were so Mexican. They were so proud. They talked about parties with mariachis and piñatas and fiestas, things that I didn't grow up with here 20 minutes from the border with Mexico. And I just remember feeling like, that's so strange. You know, they are so proud to be Mexican. And that summer before graduate school, I came home and I did the same set of questions for people here in my town, my hometown, which is so Mexican. And people distance themselves so fiercely from Mexican identity. Not all of them, but quite a few. And they teach it at school. When I was at Gadsden in the 90s, I was told, you're on the track for college. You need to learn French, not Spanish. You need to play tennis, not wall ball. You need to take ballet lessons, not ballet folklorico. That is so mean. And I know my teachers aren't mean. I still remember some of them, and when I see them at the restaurants, I go say hi and thank you for all you did, but they wanted me to be someone else inherently. And that makes me want to cry. And that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed in 20, 30 years. That was the same education my father got at Gadsden High School. You're a smart man. You need to deny everything that has to do with your culture, because the culture of education in this country is not Mexican. The language in this country is not Mexican. There's one language, there's one culture, there's one way of being, there's one way of dressing. And, you know, all of that's fine, but in a pluralistic society, we could be so much more interesting. You know, I've traveled many places in the world where it's not as rigid and you can just feel the freedom. I know a lot of you have traveled the world and there's just a different feeling. And so race is a construct. Race also has lived consequences. The question number 6 is a really powerful one. I'll read it to you all because I don't know if everyone has the list. Why is there such an emphasis on anti-Black racism? What does that mean for us in a predominantly Mexican American community? Great question. And you know, I'm an ethnic studies scholar, so I like to think about where is the problem coming from, and how does it land uniquely on different bodies. And you know, I spoke with a dear mentor yesterday. I haven't spoken with her in 10 years. She lives in California. She's an indigenous Mexican woman. I told her there's this question, you know, about how do we address anti-Blackness in a Mexican American community? You know, so the demographics in New Mexico are, you know, close to 50% Hispanic, close to 40% white, about 10 to 12% Native. These are all give or take. We need to study multiculturalism a lot more, you know, multi-race a lot more. And African American Black populations in New Mexico is about less than 2%. And so it's been a really hard conversation in my field with scholars who study race. You know, how do we honor Black Lives Matter? How do we honor this incredible, important moment and movement? And at the same time, how do we form these alliances around the fact that capitalism lands on people of color's bodies simultaneously? You know, how do we address the criminal justice system that's locking up disproportionately, cruelly, unjustly Black male bodies, brown male bodies, Native bodies? We rarely talk about Native Americans in this country. And New Mexico, we have a beautiful, vibrant Native population that has been so distressed, you know, and people continue to thrive. It's not that these are, you know, obliterated populations, but if you haven't really immersed yourself in the challenges Native Americans face, I encourage you to do so. Because, you know, we are on Native land right now as we speak. And for example, you know, people are giving the land acknowledgement, which is something NMSU just came up with last year. I was on the committee to write the land acknowledgement, which basically opens a meeting to say we acknowledge that we are on the land of Mescalero Apache people, Raramuri close by, Tortugas Pueblo, Isleta Pueblo, and then you go through the list of 25 Pueblo people, the Navajo Dene Nation, Jicarilla Apache. So you go through all of that. We're so behind, folks. People in other parts of the world are doing land back movements, you know, and that's the part, that's where we get a little bit scared, you know, because anti-racism, dismantling racism at some point means redistribution of resources. You know, it's the conversation about reparations. It's the conversation about redistribution of resources. As I'm sitting here talking to you as an almost full professor at a state institution in this state, I am still struggling for equal pay, you know, and it's okay. It's part of the global struggle that we're in, but we're not romanticizing something that happened historically. Like, oh, this happened a long time ago. People get very excited with historical oppression. You know, oh, look what happened in the 1920s. That was horrifying. You know, we just marked 100 years of women's right to vote. What's the state of women citizens in 2020? You know, that's what we should be looking at. What gains have been made in 100 years, right? Anyway, I want to say that I think that it's very important that we look at how groups have discreetly been not only oppressed, but pit against one another, right? In California, it's a very well-known example. Growers in California in the 1950s and 60s would pit Filipino ag workers against Mexican ag workers. The same lateral violence has happened in this region. The history of African-American soldiers should be celebrated, and it's very important to know about the Buffalo Soldiers' contribution to the settling of the West. We also have to complicate that with the fact that the point of the Indian Wars was to obliterate all Native people so that we could plunder the resources of this region. We also have to honor the fact, I don't know if you all know the history of Blackdom, New Mexico, that a Black family walked from Georgia to get here to the Mecca, to a free place called New Mexico in 1900. and 3. Blackdom, New Mexico was established 20 miles south of Roswell, New Mexico as a utopia for African Americans. Mexico did not have slaves. You know, Mexico has its own racial issues, but Mexico was a welcoming place for people who escaped slavery in the United States, right? So we have to honor the Black Lives Matter movement, and we have to also say, what about Mexican American lives? What about Native lives? What about Asian American lives, Southeast Asian lives, LGBTQ lives? So when people say, you know, this, if you're not for Black Lives Matter, it's because you don't believe in the value of Black lives. This is a moment of reckoning where we all ask, which lives have been diminished and which lives have been enriched, right? And if you feel, you know, take that little journal with you, and it's a blessing when you feel like, I was just big in that moment. I was just heard. I was just my full, beautiful self. But then there's many moments throughout the day where, oh, that was awful. I had to swallow that one. I had to be quiet. I had to get punished. You know, as grown adult people, I had to not vote, right? These are things that real people are experiencing on a daily basis. And the point of that list is we have relatively longer lists and relatively smaller lists, right, as human beings. And it's all part of how we relate to each other as a society, as Las Cruces, right? Are things a little bit easier for you, or are things more difficult? And that's the work that all of us can do on our own. You know, you can sort of think like, did I get through that line more quickly? Did I present in that interview better than someone else would, because of the history of how people are considered intelligent or not? Right? You've heard the studies, you know, people with accents. By the way, when I went to Michigan, everyone thought I had a very strong Mexican accent. And they would ask me to say certain words, and I would do it. And then at some point I thought, they're the weird ones. These Michiganders with their very, right? So then I would ask my Michigan friends to pronounce the strong A in candy and ham, and, you know, and it's, how can we relate to those distinct verbal iterations without being gross and racist? You know, how can it be sweet and learning? And I think, like, what I do want to share about myself is I'm all about joy and kindness and generosity, and like, how do we invite one another into a very difficult conversation? Because I don't think that we can dismantle or reach another level in our racial understanding without conversations that are pretty honest, and that we recognize we're going to make all kinds of mistakes. You know, I was like a straight A student, so I never made mistakes. I was so terrified of getting the wrong answer. And here I am so many years later thinking it's all about mistakes, because we have been conditioned as humans to be awful to ourselves and each other. So like, the idea that we're going to now be perfect and dismantle racism this year, we need to be gentle with ourselves in the process of doing this work.
Mhm. And, you know, Dulcinea, this brings me to a question, and it's sort of a question to the group. You know, we have seen that as a congregation, we're at the minimization stage. And where we want to get, if we create the love community, is that stage of adaptation where we can appreciate the differences and the uniqueness, where we can act in appropriate ways, and yet be authentic ourselves. So I am curious, given what has been discussed this far, people in our group today, I can tell you, almost all of them have been working on this, studying, reading, talking to one another. So at this point, what are some of the things that you think that we could do as a congregation, or as people, as individuals, to move to that stage of acceptance and adaptation? And if there's silence while you gather your thoughts, that's perfectly fine. But I'd love to see some hands go up and people give their ideas.
Anyway, I have to have some sayings from the Midwest. Yeah, sure. And there's a couple I can't remember them right now, but having coming from that part of the country, they have their idioms, believe me.
Mm.
which is cool.
Just unmute yourselves and speak up. You know, don't even worry about raising your hand. It's just that way we make sure we don't leave anybody out.
Hey, Larry, I just wanted to, what country do you think has done a good job in multiculturalism? I've been to many countries, and I'm trying to identify the one that has done good. Which one do you think has? Larry?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Ah, I have to think about that one, Paul. I'll get back to you. I think when I say that places feel more free, it's because a Chicana in Vienna doesn't carry the weight of Chicana-ness in Las Cruces. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Yeah.
all the places I've traveled have felt more free because I'm more free in that space. But you know, people have a lot of work to do everywhere.
Yeah, I think they do. I really do. Having been many places, I really think there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to not putting people in a little chute and moving on.
Okay, Rosa has her hand up. Rosa Morales.
Yeah, and first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Lara for giving us this information. As an individual that was raised in Mexico, I'm always amazed about some of the areas that I'm still very ignorant about issues pertaining to Mexican Americans, individuals that were born and raised here, and they confronted with, you know, acts that I didn't confront it in Mexico. So therefore, you know, it has been my long kind of a road to try to understand better. And I was going to tell you that in San Antonio, there's actually a museum that I always ask people to go and visit, and it's sponsored by UTSA, and it's called the Institute of Texian Cultures. And it's very good because what it does, when you go in there, there's a section for African Americans, for Native Americans, for Mexicans, for people from Germany and everything. And it tells you when you go in there in those sections that Texas was actually, you know, created by all these cultures, that is this mixture. And I wish that every town will have something like that because, you know, I have lived in San Antonio, El Paso, Los Angeles, Tucson, and I'm here in New Mexico. And it's very, very interesting that my first thing that I like to do is to learn more about the culture. So when I went to Tucson, I learned a lot about Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaki, which were the two tribes there. But I'm always amazed how other people don't feel the need to do that. And I went to UCLA, and I was the only Hispanic in every single classroom. And the thing that it really taught me was that it's okay to be by yourself, but it also taught me to be extremely outspoken. When I was working at Pima Community College.
That's not a problem.
Well, I have to, because there's this idea that Hispanic women don't talk, you know, and it's important to do it. For example, when I was teaching at Pima Community College, West Campus, social services, there were 34 department chairs. None of them is minorities, none of them. So somebody brought it to my attention and told me, you want to be a department chair? And I said, no, I don't think so. I really like to work with Hispanics, you know, and I like to work with the students because now, you know, the Hispanic population is growing, and that's where my effort should be. And then they said, no, but we need to have more minorities as department chair. So I went to my department chair, who was an extraordinary lady, you know, a colleague who was actually grew up in Appalachia, and a social worker. And I said, you know, I by next year, I would like to be department chair. And I want to tell you the reasons. Do you know there's 34 of them and none of them are minorities? And she said, wait a minute, Rosa, is that true? So she started listing all those 34. This is a white woman married to a black man. She never realized that there were no minorities at all. So I'm telling you that white women married to a black man, to tell you that she's not, I don't consider her racist or anything. It's just that she didn't even think anything of that. So when I mentioned that to her, she said, okay, Rosa, okay, so we're gonna put your name there. So the following year, for 3 years, I was the department chair, only Hispanic, out of 34. I was always holding my hand out, and continuously, I was not allowed to talk, but guess what? It didn't matter, because then I talk. And I talked because I thought it was so important to show them that needed to be said. And there were questions that I considered not important, and I wanted to say, that's not important for what we're discussing here. Let's talk about something else. So, so I understand that in a lot of meetings, people will come to the restroom and says, Rosa, I'm so happy that you said that. Why didn't you tell me that when I was in the meeting, when I was by myself asking the dean, why is it that we don't have any African Americans counselors? And they will say, we don't. It's like you have to bring it to their attention, because for some reason they don't even see it. So a lot of times it's part of ignorance, and it's just the fact that we have learned to just dismiss those issues. So I would propose, and I wrote multiple things here as an example. I feel very comfortable talking with people from Los Angeles that were there during the riots. Why? Because I was working for a politician, and the first thing that the riots make Los Angeles do is to talk about race. The worst thing that you can do is not talk about it. And what I learned during those 6 years of working with the city government is precisely that openness, the discussion that needs to happen. And I'm very free to talk about race. And I also know that as a Mexican social worker, I, for example, had one time a client who I was counseling, a teenager who was from Tohono O'odham, Native American. And I asked her in the first meeting, is there going to be any problem that I will be your counselor because I'm Mexican? And then I explained to my students when I was teaching social work why I said that. Because one of the first groups that actually oppressed Tohono O'odham, who are actually part in Mexico and part in Arizona, were Mexicans. And while it's not written in many books, and I don't expect this teenager to know much about history, I do know oral histories that pass from mothers to grandmothers and grandfathers. So I needed to clear that up. And it was very good that I did it. And I'm conscious that as Mexican, also Mexicans have oppressed other people. I just finished watching actually a documentary about Koreans who were taken to Mexico and also to Cuba as indentured servants, and how they were actually oppressed and actually live as slaves in Mexico. Well, there's something about that history of Mexico that I didn't know and I learned about. So there's a lot of things that sometimes we have to deal with shame, because our previous history, was part of it, but there's nothing wrong with it. The most important thing is to discuss about it. And yes, we are not a soup in this country. We are a salad, which means that each and every one of us, we have different shapes and forms, and we are all part of a great salad. When we start thinking on that and not trying to make everybody, think, oh, we are this multicultural society where we're a soup and we all dilute, that's not the case. And one of the things that I always said, one of the things that I always state in UCLA in my classes was that we have great classes on diversity, but nobody practiced anything about those classes. And I brought it to the class. I said, it's great that we all read all these books, but I don't see you having friends that are different cultures. I myself have made a point that in my personal life, in my professional life, my friends have to represent everybody. So if I don't have an African-American friend, I'm gonna go out and talk to African-Americans because I need them to be part of my life. I needed to be part of that. And as soon as I moved here to New Mexico, I'm very aware about those statistics, 2% for African-Americans, 10% Native Americans, 49% for Hispanics. I know all of that because that's exactly what I do when I move to a place. So I will, giving the information that I have is living in different places. I, for example, moved to Tucson, so my daughter, who was went to elementary and middle school in El Paso, for her to be on a setting that was not that was multicultural. And I went to Tucson and I put her in a school that was predominantly Caucasian. And she was totally lost. And I said, okay, Paloma, I know there's only 10 people like you here, but that's precisely what you need in your life to survive. When I went to Los Angeles, my son went to a high school that was predominantly African-American. And in his last year, I moved to San Antonio so he could go to UTSA, which there's only two universities predominantly Hispanic in United States. One is UTEP, which I graduated from, and the second largest is UTSA. So I took my son there and I put him on a school. He came from Los Angeles, from Hamilton High School, predominantly African-American, put him in San Antonio in Churchill High School, predominantly white. And he said,
well, we only got 5 minutes left, so we need to wrap things up.
Real fast. There's an example. Some friends have told me, Rosa, you are the only parent that I know that have moved to places to ensure that your children are multicultural. I'm recommending for the church to think about creating an institute of New Mexico cultures where the church will provide on a regular basis topics that we can attend to regarding the cultures that actually populated or live in New Mexico. Because I think in order for us to converse and to become better able to deal with each other, first we need to know about the history and the culture and everything to be open. And bring Dr. Lara and others that can really be very good on providing that information in some of those classes that I will be willing to attend. Thank you.
We've had Gilbert Smith talked about about 3-4 weeks ago, and he was representing the Pueblos. But anyway, anyone else have a few comments before we have to wrap up? Questions?
David Rice has a hand up. Yeah.
I had a comment. I really like the concept of the accommodation journal, the idea of making room for others, but I would sort of add a question to that, because in my mind, making room takes several forms. One is geography, and that's exactly why Constantine became racist. He wanted to have all the physical space, and the Indians that welcomed the Pilgrims and were accommodating them were then displaced. So there's a liability to the accommodation story. And then of course the other is time, which means if you're, it's why we have timekeepers in meetings, because if we make space for others, sometimes they take all the space if we're not careful. So, but I find it very interesting.
Rosemarie had her hand up too. Just go ahead.
Let me just respond to Native people did not welcome Pilgrims and Spaniards and say, take over our land. So that myth of passivity, what does it mean when we reimagine that there was generosity and an initial show that later got abused? So I don't think accommodation always has to be sort of a doormat where you get stepped on. And I think before we get into that kind of historical conversation, David, about how making space can get abused, what does it look like to kind of think about that on the micro level with ourselves? How do I walk into a room? How am I a tourist? How am I a visitor? How am I, how do I behave in space when I visit my friends' homes, things like that. And then we can kind of expand to the macro, but it's a good point for sure. Rosemary Sanchez.
Yes.
Hi.
I'd like to thank Dr. Dulcinea Lara for joining us. We have a lot in common. We're both from Gadsden. We're both proud Gadsden Panthers. She's from Barino, and I'm from what I called a suburb of Anthony. It was referred to as El Bosque. I guess
Bosque.
Barino and El Bosque were about maybe 2 or 3 miles separated. So there's a lot of
neighbors.
commonality here, but I just wanted to make a few points in reference to who are we and what are we when we join groups in the multiculturalism. This happened when I decided to get a little bit more involved with UU. I really became involved because of the Roundtable, your social justice issues, which I was not getting elsewhere. Born and raised a Catholic, but it's been a journey for me. And I just thought, you know, I'm not being fed how I want to be fed. But I will say that when I started going, I realized, and this happens to me a lot, when you go somewhere new, you look around and you wonder, is there anyone else that looks like me? Hispanic, Mexican American, Chicano, whatever you want to call it. But UU was so welcoming, and I am so comfortable. And this is a testament to the kind of people, to the members of UU. I also joined the League of Women Voters to understand, to learn, and I looked around. I may have been 1, maybe 2 of the entire membership that was Hispanic. So you kind of stand out a little bit, and you realize you're being looked at. You're being judged. Who are you? What are you? What do you have to offer? So it's a journey. It's a difficult journey. Unlike Dulcinea, I wasn't at the top of my class. I strived, I tried. And I shared this with you at one of the roundtables when it was time for us to go see our senior counselor, and they were going to give us advice as to what is the next step for us when we graduate from high school. And one of my dexterity tests, it was a very high rating, and the counselor told me, "Oh, Rosemary, you're going to do so good. What you want to do is go work in one of the factories in El Paso." She specifically mentioned Fara. They made jeans, like Levi jeans. And I thought, wow, I came to high school to go work at Fara. That was rough. All my friends were going to college, to New Mexico State, and I will never forget, probably the beginning of August, we're all having conversations. They all have plans. I didn't have a plan because I was literally stomped on and told I probably wasn't college material, but I was good to be a factory worker. I walked all my transcripts. I walked everything to New Mexico State. I had to learn how to do things, but it was because of my friends who said, "You can do this." They encouraged me, they helped me. But you always wonder, are you good enough? And this continues. It will always continue, especially when you're in groups where you are truly the minority. But I have to say, I have been a member of St. Albert Newman Center, which is just down the street from UU. I feel so much more welcomed here than I did at my own church. What is that? Why don't we do what some of the things that UU does? For example, the social issues, social justice issues. There's so many different factors here, but I know Rosa made many great points. I wanted to elaborate on that, but I think we're just out of time. But I just wanted to say it's difficult when you are a minority and you step forward and you want to try to become a little bit better, and you look around and there's not too many other people like yourself. So we're extremely challenged. Rosa has great experiences because she's been to San Antonio, to Los Angeles. I come from Gadsden, as did Dulcinea. She's got a PhD. I admire this young girl. I graduated with her dad from Gadsden High School, and he is now Dr. Lara in the chemistry department. But you just have to realize, I think, some of the stumbling blocks that we have to try and overcome. And at the age of 71, I'm still trying to overcome them. This will just be forever that we continue, but we don't want to ever give up. Even if we're just one minority in the entire group, that's okay. We've got to keep on going.
And I want you all to know that Rosemary did finish her bachelor's and a master's and had a very wonderful career at New Mexico State for 25 years. So it's really important that we let all of our young people know that you can do anything if you believe in yourself. If she had taken the messages of the counselor, she might still be working at the Farrah factory or have just retired.
It probably closed. Anyway,
Gee.
thanks to Rosemary and Rosa. We're getting close to our end here. We try to keep within an hour. And let's recognize.
Paul,
speakers.
excuse me, Paul. Can I ask you why do we have to keep up to an hour? Because I know you're very good with the timing, no question about it.
Well,
But why